Thanks, Hector, for inviting me. I'm not part of the home team. I thought about going to school at the new school about 45 years ago, but it didn't work out. I couldn't find a parking place. So I had to go elsewhere. But my response to the book is different, and as you will see. Benjamin Franklin, so we are told, wrote a letter to Tom Paine after reading the manuscript Paine had sent him of a work in progress called The Age of Reason. The letter was perhaps sent in 1786, maybe not written by Franklin, but is still remembered as such. This alleged letter of Franklin's is as easy to find online as it is difficult to date precisely, or to authenticate, because every minister searching for a founding father's legitimation of his trade knows it, and borrows from it during one sermon or another. In his 2003 biography of Franklin, Walter Isaacson committed over 700 words in small font, probing the question of the letter's date and authenticity. He concludes against the Yale letters of the complete Franklin edition that it was indeed written in 1786 and by Franklin. In 1938, Carl Van Doren's biography of Franklin won the Pulitzer, but he did not mention the famous letter to Paine. One wonders if Isaacson's careful sleuthing 65 years later was an advance in scholarship. Perhaps it is a symptom of our age of unreason. Here in part is what Franklin probably wrote to his friend and admirer Tom Paine. Quote, "Though your reasonings are subtle and may prevail with some readers, you will not succeed so as to change the general sentiments of mankind on that subject." That subject was religious belief. "And the consequences of printing this piece will be a great deal of odium drawn upon yourself, mischief to you, and no benefit to others. He that spits against the wind spits in his own face. I would advise you, therefore, not to attempt unchaining the tiger, but to burn this piece before it is seen by any other persons. Thereby you will save yourself a great deal of mortification by the enemies it may raise against you, and perhaps a good deal of regret and repentance. If men are so wicked with religion, what would they be if without it?" Unquote. Paine accepted Franklin's advice and postponed publishing The Age of Reason until 1794, 4 years after Franklin's death. Despite Franklin's wise advice, I feel the strongest urge to spit directly into the Bergerian hail and the Luckmannian cyclone, the almost universal acclaim that SCR has won for itself in English plus its 18 translations. How many serious books titles become a slogan within a few years of being published, even if in bastardized form? How many remain in print 50 years after publication, quote, "still selling well," unquote, according to Berger's autobiography? SCR has long since transcended the ontological status of mere monograph, quote, morphing into an astonishing phenomenon of global reach and persuasiveness. Its title is as famous as The Lonely Crowd, Middletown, The Power Elite, Organization Man, and others from those golden days of sociology's more robust past. And like the declining significance of race, it has benefited from the fact that everybody knows the title, while very few people any longer read the book with care. If everybody knows the main argument, why bother reading the mere details? After all, there are tweaks to attend to. Lately it has occurred to some scholars that they might recover Das Kapital, and when they open its volumes, they find a great deal that illuminates today's sad economic environment. Yet what they discover there bears only a slight relation to the more philosophical existentialist Marx, which many take to be Marxism in toto. Similarly, should the vast army of social constructionists return to SCR, the motherlode, and read it carefully, they will find that it does not support their febrile arguments unless viewed through the distorting lens of poor hermeneutic practice. This is why Berger and Luckmann, imitating Marx himself, quote, have felt constrained to say repeatedly, "We are not constructivists," unquote. Berger, 2011. Of course, part of this misattribution is the two authors' own fault due to a miscalculation that came back to haunt them. As Berger himself admitted in 2009, quote, "Perhaps the word construction was unfortunate, as it suggested creation ex nihilo, as if one said, there is nothing but our constructions. But this was not the author's intention. What they proposed was that all reality was subject to socially derived interpretations," unquote. Had they more accurately titled the book The Social Interpretation of Reality, we would almost surely not be here celebrating its 50th birthday, despite its intrinsic value otherwise. But these two brash young men had a plan, hatched in 1962 when Berger was 33 and Luckmann 35. They composed their manifesto in January 1963, just after Berger had finished 5 years working at the Hartford Seminary Foundation in Connecticut, and then becoming a faculty member at the new school. With a tight cabal of like-minded relatives and colleagues in New York City, which Berger called a clique, they planned to redirect sociology so that their sense of it, based primarily on the vast, unpublished work of Alfred Schutz, of course, in addition to selected ideas of Mead, Weber, and Durkheim seasoned with a pinch of Marx, could get them jobs and win for them the esteem they believed could be and should be theirs. They no longer wished to be, quote, marginal players in the thriving sociological drama, when, it should be remembered, sociology was fast becoming the most popular undergraduate major in the United States. Berger and Luckmann expressed the phenomenal chutzpah of youth by planning a series of articles and books that would transform sociology, snatching it away from the Parsons Merton clan of structural functionalists, by friendly implication ally itself with the symbolic interactionists whose homes were in Chicago, Iowa, and Berkeley, and incidentally slay the quantitative dragon that lurked at Wisconsin, Ohio State, and other large galumphing sites of quantophrenia, to use Pitteram Sorokin's term of abuse. And to do that, they needed a catchy title, and so they found one. As they have both said many times since, the book caught on and helped shape the prevailing zeitgeist while also reflecting it. But within a few years, as the winds of fashion blew stronger from France and from Germany, their admiring audience stopped reading the book itself, and instead simply hijacked its title, putting it to their own peculiarly solipsistic uses, few of which Berger or Luckmann found appealing. They have agreed since that should they rewrite the book, they would change little, even if their authorial intentions were lost on most readers. Not only was the main title something of a scam, but so too was the haughty subtitle, A Treatise in the Sociology of Knowledge, which a recent sympathetic study called a marketing ploy. That's Fadenhauer, 2013. Aimed mostly at scholars in Germany, where Luckmann hoped to work. The two authors had made much of Arnold Galen's and Helmut Pletzner's ideas in the book, neither of whom were well known in the States. And as Pletzner observed in the German edition, quote, while many German sociologists would be irritated by the word construction in the title, are you irritated? Okay. They would be appeased by the subtitle, because, quote, the sociology of knowledge is an old favorite of German readers. She said, das ist richtig. As an aside, I can hazard a guess as to why that's the case. Crafty German intellectuals adore the word sogenannt, which means so-called. They live to demystify, ironize, debunk, and satirize whatever beliefs someone proposes with which they disagree, often those originating in France. But not in a violent or overtly rude way, especially since World War II. They prefer to snicker rather than guffaw. For example, Alfred Schutz, Berger and Luckmann's teacher and inspiration, wrote, quote, structure determines, among other things, the social distribution of knowledge and its relativity and relevance to the concrete social environment of a concrete group in a concrete historical situation. Here are the legitimate problems of relativism, historicism, and the so-called sociology of knowledge. Schutz, 1962. Or you might say, I'm giving a Sogenannten Vortrag, a so-called lecture, that I hold a Sogenannten Lehrstuhl, a so-called professorship as a social theorist at Penn State, over 4 hours from Midtown by limo, thus by definition chillingly remote from where true intellection takes place. But we will not pursue that notion here other than to say that Berger and Luckmann were not entirely earnest in their choice of title and subtitle. So if the authors do not support postmodernist, egocentric denials of social structure that constitute so many constructivist positions, and if my address to you today concerns social construction of fantasy, which is the title of my talk that I neglected to tell you, in what way exactly do I spit into the enduring headwinds originally created by Berger and Luckmann, then taken up by throngs of their misinterpreting admirers? To answer this even partially within the limits of this occasion, we must turn back to the book itself and practice the sort of tedious hermeneutics for which Berger and Luckmann had little patience, as evidenced by the tone and structure of the book itself. Only through this time-worn method can I substantiate my long-held belief that SCR undercut a promising trajectory of what was then still a young mode of sociological inquiry, which could have taken another, in my eyes, more fruitful path had it not been for their timely, quote, intervention. My data preliminary to discussing certain aspects of the book are these. 1, a careful rereading of the text itself after a hiatus of about 35 years when I first studied it in order to teach the book. 2, Bill Moyer's 28-minute interview with Peter Berger in 1989 on videotape and several YouTube performances by Berger. 3, Berger's private letters to and from Irving Louis Horowitz held at the Horowitz Archive in the Penn State Library, of which there are over 200 exchanged between 1965 and 1999. 4, a study of all 9 reviews the book received that I could find, neither the AJS nor Social Forces, 2 of the 3 top outlets at the time for sociological book reviews, with published treatments of the book. 5, Berger's 2011 autobiography, and also Michaela Fadenhauer's recently published The New Sociology of Knowledge, The Life and Work of Peter Berger. 6, Schutz's works. 7, Mannheim's and Shaler's works, most of which I read carefully many years ago. And 8, books and articles that begin with The Social Construction of Whatever. Most notably, Ian Hacking's book, mentioned already, The Social Construction of What. I've also enjoyed Asia Friedman's Blind to Sameness, Expectations and the Social Construction of Male and Female Bodies. This is not a truly sufficient basis for a hermeneutically keen assessment of the book, but one does one's best within limited time. At this point, it is worth recalling that Berger's autobiography carries the subtitle, How to Explain the World Without Becoming a Bore. And perhaps even more self-revelatory, the opening chapter of the same book, which is entitled Balzac on 12th Street. During a particularly fertile period of what he calls biblioria, Berger composed his first novel, using the pseudonym Felix Bastian. In 1964, he became bored while summering on Lake Maggiore in a beautiful southern canton of Switzerland and used writing fiction to dilute his tedium. He had long before been accused by a French professor of being more a literateur than a social scientist, and his novel writing seemed to validate that diagnosis. The next summer, he wrote a second novel, but it was not published until 10 years later by a small firm specializing in religious books, and was likely accepted because of the fame of his sociology titles from the 60s, rather than for its literary merit. Yet he surely did not throw himself into the role of novelist with complete abandon. Quote, I had realized by now how marginal I was to the mainstream of American sociology. And after all, I was nursing dreams of building an empire with our new approach to sociological theory, unquote, as announced, of course, in SCR. This accounts for his use of a pseudonym with the first novel, for fear of being tagged a mere literateur by the fiercely scientistic people who bore the title American sociologist. Berger and Luckmann were both acutely aware of their Eurocentric mode of scholarship, which became both their strength and their handicap, professionally speaking. It did not help that SCR's endnotes were larded with a preponderance of references to untranslated German and French writings. One senses from SCR that Berger, perhaps more than Luckmann, dreaded becoming a scholarly parody of a real person, like George Eliot's pretentious Casaubon, so in love with his own hyper-specialized knowledge that the real world, what Schultz called the paramount reality, disappears from his blinkered view. Perhaps by spending 2 years in uniform at Fort Benning, Georgia, listening patiently to accounts of soldiers' psychological crises and trying to resolve them by means of the sociology he learned at the New School, he could not become the otherworldly Luftmensch exemplified by Karl Mannheim, Max Scheler, and others who founded Wissensoziologie, but instead evolved into a man of the people. He feared being seen as a Europeanized, self-absorbed bookworm. In another context, while lecturing in Iran 10 years later, he observed that, quote, intellectuals are typically unaware of the stirrings and the bazaars of the, quote, unenlightened, unquote. And this brand of short-sightedness he always strived to avoid. As for Luckmann, before repatriating to Germany, he taught for a while in the U.S. at Hobart College, the sort of experience that can have a sobering effect upon the most elevated mind. Even a casual reader of SCR will notice a few items of compositional interest, mannerisms and practices that might be considered pre-substantive. At this point, it would be instructive to subject all audience members to a polygraph test with the question, have you read The Social Construction of Reality with enough care to remember its main points? Affirmative answers from a majority would save me time, but alas, I did not bring my polygraph equipment with me today. First, the introduction, first 18 pages, which the authors claim readers could reasonably skip, which was lifted from an earlier article that raced through the history of Wissensoziologie from Marx forward with dizzying speed and superficiality. It may have impressed American readers at the time, because of its 28 endnotes, which cite 52 authoritative scholars, many in French and German, or they may have taken the author's advice and skipped reading it. The section of SCR puts youthful effrontery on full display. Within this slight incursion into a difficult subject, Berger and Luckmann gallop through huge fields of thought on their determined way to a polemically anchored destination. They claim not to be argumentatively inspired, but the pretended neutrality of their prose belies the posture. Marx's pivotal ideas about Unterbau and Überbau they damn with faint praise, eventually arguing that even his most gifted expositor, Lukács, was too determinist when connecting a protagonist's social position with the contents of his or her consciousness and speech. In a remarkable sleight of hand, I can ignore this because I've been handing this to other people. They claim that Shaler's, Mannheim's, and Grunwald's early versions of the sociology of knowledge, or noseo-sociology as suggested by Gerard de Grey, are defective because they dwell only on high cultural expression and politically sophisticated ideologies, apparently believing that everyday life is unfit for analysis. Such a claim handily makes room for the Schutzian approach his two able students were proselytizing. Because Berger and Luckmann cite many pertinent works by title, even if with sparse specific quotations or page numbers, they appear to have surveyed the field judiciously and found it wanting. It is likely they borrowed significantly from their teachers at the New School, Karl Mayr and Albert Salomon, and their peers Kurt Wolff and Friedrich Tenbruck. They cited none of Shaler's or Mannheim's many works except by title, and were therefore unable to prove the strength of their complaints in the conventional way. Readers in the U.S. unable to read the originals or exhausted by the translations might well have believed they were being gently led out of the perdition of European distant sociology and into more sensible and accessible zone of social constructionism. What a relief that must have been for those who had found Mannheim's work, not to mention Shaler's, difficult to digest. And yet consider one contrary quotation among hundreds from Mannheim's most famous book, apparently giving the lie to Berger and Luckmann's most general complaint, that the sociology of knowledge concerned itself only with high culture and politics. From Ideology and Utopia, quote, "This debunking tendency in the thought of our time has become very marked." Note 8, Carl Schmitt analyzed this characteristic contemporary manner of thought very well when he said that we are in continual fear of being misled. Consequently, we are perpetually on guard against disguises, sublimations, and refractions, unquote. And even though in wide circles this trait, the debunking tendency, is considered undignified and disrespectful, and indeed, insofar as debunking is an end in itself, criticism is justified, this intellectual position is forced upon us in an era of transition like our own, which finds it necessary to break with many of the antiquated traditions and forms, so said Mannheim. This could not be clearer or more down to earth, not to mention as relevant now as then, if not more so. In fact, it summarizes precisely what Goffman proposed about 25 years later, and of which Berger and Luckmann made approving use. It is a fool's errand to dismiss Shaler and Mannheim as mandarins without awareness of everyday dialogue. In fact, Mannheim's wife, Julia Mannheim-Lang, was a practicing psychoanalyst, and he thanks her for informing his own work, for keeping it grounded. There are other surface features of SCR which draw one's attention during a close reading. Every social theorist falls in love with certain terms, either of their own invention or redefined to suit their project, and in this Berger and Luckmann were no exception. Their prose did indeed flow nicely, except when it overstretched for pedantic effect, but there were certain ordinary words without which their argument would have become much weaker, and which became, perhaps unconsciously, their battle flags. We'll begin with one, available. Of a dozen uses that I noted between pages 32 and 178, here is an early instance. The typifications of habitualized actions that constitute institutions are always shared ones. They are available to all members of the particular social group in question. Or from later, there is always more objective reality available than is actually internalized in any individual consciousness, simply because the contents of socialization are determined by the social distribution of knowledge. Aside from sounding much like Marx, if lightened in complexion, this use of available sounds almost like a magical incantation. One wonders what it means. Objective reality being available in too large a form to saturate the socialization process, perhaps? In a section on roles, an orgy of availables appears without warning or precedent. A generally available pattern in a matrilogical society, socially available typifications, objectively available typifications, and so on. The Schutzian point Berger and Luckmann wish to emphasize is that what a person does in the social world, especially through language and pattern behavior, is there to be inspected, considered, appropriated perhaps, rejected at times, and otherwise, influenced by others reciprocally in face-to-face situation. Hence they claim that such typifications are available to all members of the social order. Were he with us today, Professor Berger would indeed be available to me and to our colleagues up to a point we could question him at will, and he would be obliged to answer or politely turn our inquiries aside. And immediately after this event, he would no longer be available to any of us unless he chose to be. And when Peter Berger himself visited the Vatican in 1969 and met Pope Paul VI, availability is a very short-term mutual experience, likely unique in a given biography. This goes on for a while. But I won't. Thank you.